Everybody, we are live. I'm Gila Glassberg. I'm a registered dietitian and a certified intuitive eating counselor, and I am 6 minutes late. I'm really sorry. I couldn't get into Instagram, so I guess that happens sometimes. Okay, so I am a dietitian, and I am also a certified intuitive eating counselor. Hello. And tonight's topic is honor your hunger and respect your fullness. So I'll just say that this is the third live already. The first live, we were just talking about what is intuitive eating. And the second live was the first principle of intuitive eating, which is reject the diet mentality. So tonight, hi guys. Tonight, we are talking about the topic, honor your hunger and respect your fullness, which are actually two principles of intuitive eating that I like to teach together. So I'm gonna read the questions that came in, and I'm hoping to answer the questions through sort of some education about this principle. Okay, so two questions that came in. Is there a place for eating when I'm not hungry? What do I do if someone offers me a piece of their birthday cake and I'm not hungry, but I don't want to be rude? That's one question. I guess it's two questions about the same person. And the next question is intuitive eating simply eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're full? Or is there more to it? Okay, so right off the bat, that second question I'll answer first is that no, it's not just eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. There's 8 other principles. So I actually like to teach it the way that I am teaching it here, which is first, what is rejecting the diet mentality, getting really familiar with your diet culture mentality, really just like kind of like shining a flashlight on it and asking yourself, like, do I want to continue dieting? Has it helped me? Has it served me? Has it made me more obsessed with food? Has it made me lose weight then gain more? And you can go back and watch that from last week. So honor your hunger and respect your fullness. I want you to think about it as actually a scale from 0 to 10. Okay, so 0 is like starving, ravenous. Think of like a fast day like we just had last week. And a 10 is like stuffed, like you can't breathe, you're uncomfortable, like you have to unbutton your pants, like Thanksgiving full, right? So 0 to 10. So first of all, and then there's all the numbers in between. So the way that intuitive eating kind of explains it is that we all feel hunger and fullness differently, and we all feel hunger and fullness based on different things. So that's where it's so different with dieting, because when you're on a diet, or maybe some of you have been on specific diets, then the diet is dictating to you when to eat, what to eat, and how much to eat, and it's actually in many ways turning off your hunger fullness cues. So for example, let's say you're doing Weight Watchers and you have a certain amount of points, right? And it's the end of the day, it's 9 p.m. and your stomach growls, like you get a direct message from your stomach that you're hungry, and you say to yourself, I can't be hungry because I used up all my points. So you start ignoring that hunger cue. Or on the flip side, I know many of my clients, hi everybody, I know many of my clients have been on OA, which is Overeaters Anonymous, and there is a very strict diet that goes along with it. And the diet is so that you have to weigh and measure your food. And when it is time to eat, you can't not eat your portion allotted. You must eat all of it. That's just part of it. And I think the premise of that is that, like, they know how much you need to eat in order to not get hungry throughout the day and to stay full. And even if you've gotten a fullness cue, you have to ignore that, because then you're going to get hungry when you're not ready to eat according to the plan. So you see how dieting kind of turns off those hunger fullness cues. Now, kids naturally have hunger fullness cues. You might see that with your kids, that like you could give them a plate of food with like for example, a hot dog, hamburger, some French fries, and some cucumbers, and then for dessert you might give them like a cupcake or something. You might see them eat like half of all those things, even including half of the cupcake, because they're just not hungry anymore, and we haven't turned off their hunger fullness cues, although many of us have, because we tell them, like, you can't be hungry, you just ate, or just take one more bite, right? Like, that is how we turn off hunger and fullness cues. So the point of the hunger fullness scale from 0 to 10, 0 being ravenously hungry and 10 being extremely full, uncomfortably full, possibly nauseous, is that we want you to learn to gauge your own hunger fullness cues. Okay, so from 0 to 10. So everybody experiences hunger at different levels and in different ways in your body. So that's what I want you to try to do. And you could even do that now if any of you, it's 6:10, maybe you're feeling hungry, maybe you just ate dinner, maybe you want to think about the hunger fullness scale and even rate your hunger fullness. So according to the scale, the 2 to 4 range is like comfortable hunger, or what we call polite hunger. But obviously the whole point of the scale is that it's subjective to you. So maybe you're much more comfortable being like a 0 or a 1, whereas somebody's more comfortable being a 2 or a 4. So maybe it's not making sense because you can't see the hunger fullness scale, but if you wanted to, you could just Google a simple hunger fullness scale and you'd be able to see that. So first you want to start with understanding the hunger fullness scale, which we try to practice in the session, and say like rate your hunger. Okay, so let's say somebody's hunger is like a 3. So then I would ask the client, okay, when was the last time you ate, right? So maybe they'll say an hour ago, but now I'm a 3. So I'll ask them, what did you eat? And they'll say something like a salad that just had lettuce and some cucumbers and tomatoes with no dressing, no protein, no carb, right? So I'll say to them, I understand why you might be confused why you're hungry right now because you just ate an hour ago, but you actually ate very little calories. So it makes sense that you're hungry an hour later. Or let's say eating an apple let's say you want to calculate in your head that you need to eat, you're not going to have time to eat from one time to the next, and you're not feeling super hungry now, but you don't want to get overly hungry. So you might eat an apple, or you might eat an apple and peanut butter because you know from experience that when you combine foods that you feel fuller longer. So that's the whole point of the hunger fullness scale, is that everyone experiences hunger and fullness in different ways, and that when you start eating at a level of hunger that's comfortable for you, it's much easier for you to stop at a level of fullness that's comfortable for you. So when you start eating when you're too hungry, like 0 or a 1, many people tend to not be able to stop eating until they're 8, 9, or 10, which is uncomfortably full. And they might even think to themselves, oh my God, I'm so out of control with food. I can't control myself. I'm a food addict. But really, if you think about it and you take away all that diet culture noise, you're not a food addict, you're just not eating enough, or you're not eating frequently enough, or you're not eating foods that you like enough. So you're going to continue to get cues of hunger that you don't like because you're not really feeding yourself properly. It doesn't mean that you are a food addict. And a good example of this is like, people always tell me that like Friday night, they don't know why, they just like binge on challah, or like they eat more than they would assume that they would have eaten. And when I go through their day with them, very often they didn't eat lunch because they were too busy, or there's no structure of the day, or there's less structure of the day, and they come to the meal really, really, really hungry. And what's the first thing that they eat? Is challah, oftentimes processed carbs. So the easiest form of energy for your body to get is processed carbs, like white flour. So if you, again, take away all that, the fact that it's like white flour is so like loaded with like diet culture voices, and it's horrible for you, and it's going to kill you, and it's going to ruin your gut. It won't actually do that, but let's say like diet culture voices are saying that, and you're like, why am I not craving, broccoli and salmon and sweet potatoes? And there's a reason why, because biologically it's kind of like you're underwater coming up gasping for air. So when you start eating when you're too hungry, you very often will only be able to stop eating when you're too full. And there's so many other components that affect your hunger and fullness. So for example, if you're used to using food to cope with your emotions and you start eating when you have no biological cues of hunger, so you're like a 5 or a 6, you're neutral or a little bit full, then why would you stop eating when you're full? Because you didn't start when you were hungry. So it's really, really important for you to understand your natural hunger fullness cues. So another part of this principle, honor your hunger, is that not everybody experiences hunger the same way. So for many of us, we think we're hungry when our stomach is growling, or we think of hunger as only stomach hunger. But for many people, when you start feeling a rumbling, achiness, gnawing in your stomach, that's actually a little too hungry. So it's important to understand that there are other cues of hunger that we might not have been told or taught as a kid, or we might have been told to ignore as a kid or as an adult, because, I don't know, maybe just that's one of those things you don't think you have to teach. Or maybe it's one of those things that we've just really drilled out of people. So we really have to reinstate those natural cues that we do have. So you could think about it right now. Feel free to share. If you are feeling hungry, it's a good time to check in and say, what am I feeling in my body? So yes, many people do feel hunger in their stomach with that rumbling, achy, gnawing. But then there's other cues of hunger, like hangry, like a mood change, like hungry and angry, right? So that's a big one that people don't realize, that when they're like getting through their day and having a great day and their mood's totally fine, and then all of a sudden they're like very, very irritable, and something that wouldn't upset them really does, and then they look at the clock and they realize they haven't eaten in 4 hours, that's a good sign to know that when you start to notice a mood change, that's probably a hunger cue for you. Not for everybody, but for you. I know for myself that that's definitely a cue of mine. And I know that when I start feeling more annoyed than usual, I'm like, oh, right, I have to eat. And that's just normal. Our bodies have to eat. It's part of life. It's part of living. We are supposed to eat to get fuel. Just like a car can't work without gas, a body cannot work without food. It cannot work optimally. Most people feel hungry while they're awake every 2 to 3 hours. Again, everybody's different. It could be 1.5 hours. It could be every 5 hours. And it can be very dependent on what you eat in the other meal and many other factors, like if you exercised or not. So there's so many things to think about in terms of hunger and fullness. They go together. Then there's other cues like in your head. So you might feel hungry with a headache or lightheadedness or just like you can't concentrate. Those are all signs of hunger in your head. But another important sign is that you might actually start thinking about food more. And it doesn't mean that every single time you think about food that you're hungry, obviously not, but it could be, if you want like some good advice, just to think about it like this, that if you're like doing nothing related to food, like you're working at your desk or you're busy with your kids, and all of a sudden you think like, what should I make for dinner or what am I having for Shabbos? That could be a sign of hunger. That doesn't mean that it is a sign of hunger, but it could be because your brain is trying to get you to eat. Your brain wants you to eat in order to live, right? That's why people who have eating disorders, they think about food all the time because their brain is so desperate for calories. Their brain wants them to survive. The way that our bodies are wired is for survival. So when our bodies start to think we don't have enough food, you might start thinking about food. And again, that's not everybody's cue, but it could definitely be a cue of hunger. So just that's something to pay attention to. Like I'll tell clients for the first like week or two to like track their hunger fullness. For many people, that's like extremely triggering because they've been dieting for so long and they had to write down their food. So like if it is triggering at all, don't do that. And you don't have to eat every few hours, but just check in every few hours. If you want to write it down, write it down. If it's too triggering for you to write it down, then don't write it down. But it's something that you could discuss with a friend or a dietitian if it's too triggering for you to write it down. There's other signs of hunger, like sometimes people feel a little bit tired. Sometimes people feel hunger in their throat or esophagus with like a dull ache or gnawing. And I always say I've never experienced that feeling, but when I do explain this to clients, they tell me that it's true, that that is where they experience hunger. If anyone wants to share, I could see the comments. If they've heard about this concept of hunger fullness, if they know what their signs of hunger and fullness are, or if they're curious or they realize that they actually don't know when they're hungry or full. So a good way to get started with the hunger fullness is that you should be eating, let's just say, this is a good general piece of advice, every 2 to 3 hours. So a lot of times I tell clients to set alarms for 2 to 3 hours on your phone. So let's say you wake up at 8 a.m., you want to start around within the hour. So let's say 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. So there's 5 to 6 meals and snacks, like 3 meals, 3 snacks. That's probably how we got that number, 3 meals and 3 snacks. There's also something important to keep in mind in terms of fullness, that when you eat foods that are combined, like protein, carbs, fat, and fiber, that's going to keep you, most people, that will keep you fullest the longest. So that doesn't mean that you always want to be the fullest the longest. It just means that that's a good piece of advice for when you are planning your meals, right? So for example, it's 5 o'clock at night and you're really, really, really hungry, but at 6 o'clock at night, you're going out with your friends to a restaurant. Are you going to eat a meal that has protein, carbs, fat, and fiber that's going to fill you up till 8? I would assume that wouldn't work for you because you don't want to be in pain. You don't want to be overly hungry. You don't want to go to the restaurant overly hungry. But that doesn't mean that you should eat until you're super, super stuffed. So it's interesting to think about this in terms of diet culture, that like so many of us, including myself, before I learned about this, is that like we always want to think about food that fills us up the longest, or we always want to think about food that has the most protein. But like that's just not true. Like everybody's different. Like I know for myself that if I don't have a carb in my meal, I will not be full, even if I don't have a protein, or even if I have less protein than carbs. And that's me. And that's something that when I was like in my dieting days, even if I wasn't necessarily on a diet, I just kind of was stuck with my diet rules. I always used to think, as long as I eat whole grains, then I could eat as much as I want. And then was with other coworkers that were dietitians that said, no, carbs are horrible for you. You could only eat carbs from fruits or carbs from vegetables. And then I kind of couldn't get it out of my head. And I just realized, like, if I eat a salad for lunch, I'm just going to be hungry 2 hours later. And it really doesn't work for me. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Like sometimes I don't need to eat. I'm able to eat in 2 hours. Like I have that window, but sometimes I know that between my busy day, I won't be able to eat for 4 hours. I'm not going to eat a salad. That's just going to make me really grouchy and uncomfortable because I'm going to be hungry. So again, everybody feels hunger and fullness differently. So the second question I definitely answered. And the first question is there a place for eating when I'm not hungry? That's kind of like what I just answered. So we don't only eat because we're hungry, and intuitive eating is not the hunger fullness diet. The hunger fullness principles are just to get you to understand that this is what hunger feels like, this is what fullness feels like, and generally speaking, we eat because we're hungry and we stop because we're full. Although there's so much mixed into it, most of the time we eat when we're hungry and we stop when we're full. Are there other reasons to eat? Let's say it's your wedding and there's wedding cake and you're not hungry at all. Like, would you say, like, I shouldn't have a piece of my wedding cake because I'm not hungry? Or you're going out with friends for ice cream and you're not really hungry, but you want to engage in the activity. So there's nothing wrong with doing that sometimes. The only problem is when you use food to cope all the time, or when you're eating all the time when you're not hungry, and it's just, you start to graze. Like you don't really eat proper meals. You're like, I'm not really hungry, but there's food here, so then you eat, and then you're not really hungry for your next meal. So the whole day you're not really hungry and you're not really full. And most people do feel more comfortable when they're eating when they're hungry, and they're stopping when they're full, not when they're eating when they're not hungry. So that's why it's important to plan those things. So just think about it for a second. There are definitely reasons to eat when you're not hungry, and that's why intuitive eating is very, very, very flexible, and it's very gentle, and it's very much goes in with your life. But just have a general awareness that, like, you don't always want to be eating when you're not hungry. You don't want to get into the habit of that. We really are supposed to be mostly eating when we're hungry, but it's not a rule. You could only eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. Really, that's just another way of dieting. This is just a good way of living, and it's much more comfortable when you notice your hunger cues. You're able to listen to them, and this, of course, piggybacks off of other themes and principles in intuitive eating, like self-care. Like, it's a mom or any person shouldn't be eating nothing until 6 p.m. at night. Of course you're going to be binging. Like, that's just the way it works. If you don't eat enough food, your body goes into, like, feed me or I'm going to eat my arm, and then you're all bets are off with what you're going to eat. So that means that you want to be eating more frequently. You don't want to go 5 hours without eating in the day and then binge on food. That's not good for you, and it's just not comfortable. So think about it. There's definitely times when you're going to eat when you're not hungry, and that's okay. There's also some, like, emotional components to that, but I'll talk about that when we talk about not using food to cope with your emotions, because it's kind of a different topic. Okay, so now this part of the question is very interesting. What do I do if someone offers me a piece of their birthday cake? I'm not hungry, but I don't want to be rude. Like, I don't know this person, and I don't know the context of the question, but I think that's such an interesting part of our culture, that when somebody cooks for us and we don't eat the food, it's considered rude. And I totally understand, because, like, just this Shabbos, I was, like, serving food to my kids, and they were like, no, I don't want potato kugel. And I'm like, why don't you want potato kugel? I made it for you. I thought you loved potato kugel. And I did feel, like, a little bit sad, and, like, I don't always, like, I tried to practice all these things that I preach, but, like, I'm a human, and it's normal to feel that way. It's definitely a part of our culture. But if you take a step back, I find that it's, like, very poor boundary setting, like, when we do that. Like, please, like, could you have a piece of my cake? It's my birthday. I want you to enjoy. And again, there's no reason for you not to eat if you want to eat and the food tastes good and you're in the moment and you're able to stop when you're not too full. But to eat because you want to please someone, I really think that that's part of, like, an unhealthy dynamic of, like, trying to please someone, even if it's at your negative expense. So of course, this could just be a very, like, simple question that's not, like, loaded, and that she doesn't feel like she's being pressured to eat often. But I just want you to think about it from both sides. And again, this is hard for me, but when I'm offering somebody food, because I love them, or because they came over and I want to make sure they have food, and they say, oh, I'm actually not hungry. I don't think any of us like to feel rejected, and for some reason, like, that feels very rejecting. But I think it's important to know that, like, people are trying to listen to their bodies, and when they're hungry, and when they're full, and it's really not an insult. Like, you don't have to eat if you're not hungry to not insult somebody. And I think that You'll often hear me say that intuitive eating leads to intuitive living. And I think that this is like a huge overlap with the fact that we like kind of push people to do things that they're uncomfortable with and ignore their body cues in general. So like, for example, like back in the day when we were kids, if like your uncle walked in the room and your parent told you to hug them and you didn't want to, it was considered very rude. And the parent would often push the child to hug the relative that they weren't comfortable with. And now I feel like we've learned a lot that we don't want to do that to kids or adults, because we are teaching them to turn off the cues of their body. Like, it doesn't mean that every time you get a cue from someone that you don't want to touch them, that they're creepy. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, let's think about that for a second in terms of what we're teaching our kids about disregarding what our body's telling us. So let's say like you're feeding your kid food and they say they're full, even though they eat half the plate, and you're like, you can't possibly be full. I'm not talking about the fact that they come back 10 minutes later. That's a whole different discussion about how to feed your kids and the feeding dynamic, which I'll try to do a live on. But just think about it from that level, that like very surface level of like, you can't be full, you only ate XYZ, or you can't be hungry, I fed you an hour ago. That's not really true. Think about it. Sometimes we do feel hungry an hour later, like if we just had a yogurt or we just had an apple. Like, I don't feel full from that. That I know in my head, because I practice this, that I will probably be hungry again within the half hour to an hour if I had a yogurt or an apple. Everybody's different. Or if you exercise that day, that's going to affect your fullness and your hunger. For many people, they tell me the day that they exercise, they feel much, much, much more hungry. Many other people tell me that they don't feel more hungry the day they exercise, they feel hungrier the next day, right? So there's so many components that will affect your hunger and fullness. And I like to really solidify this with clients. I want people to practice this for a week or two before they move on to principles like challenging the food police or not using food to cope with your emotions, because we're so confused with physical hunger versus emotional hunger that until we are able to be confident that we know that this is physical hunger, because we've really thought about it, we've really practiced it, and we've really identified what our hunger fullness cues are, then we can move on to like, well, I know I'm not hungry because I know that I'm only hungry when my stomach growls or okay, I feel strong after exercise. So it's really, really hard to talk and see the comments. Okay, thank you. I love what you're saying. I also feel really strong after I exercise, but maybe you might notice that you feel hungrier that day or you feel hungrier the next day. So I just got distracted by the comments. Sorry. So that's basically the principles of honor your hunger, respect your fullness. Feel free to ask me any questions here or any comments. I would love to hear anything that you have to say. This is what I was going to say. That you're going to be able to identify if you're physically hungry or you're emotionally hungry, because you've identified your hunger fullness cues. Another point about fullness is that I do this with clients all the time in session, or I tell them to do it, and it might sound confusing, so I'll try to explain it the best I can, but it might be something that you have to experience yourself. But if you wanted to understand when you feel full in your body, you could try this exercise, that when you're not super hungry or super full and you drink water until you get a sensation of fullness in your stomach. I'm not telling you to disregard to make yourself not feel hungry with water. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if you wanted to do that to get a sense of how physical fullness feels in your stomach, like many people say like their stomach feels distended, or they just don't really think about food anymore, or the food stops tasting as good. That's all a mechanism that your body has, that the food tastes best when you're politely hungry, and then it stops losing its pleasurable qualities as fullness starts to emerge. That's another part of intuitive eating that we oftentimes don't really pay attention to our fullness, because we're distracted, we're on our phones, we're doing other things, which is fine. That's part of 2023. But if you could start to just pay attention to like, am I doing this every day, all day? Do I sometimes want to turn off my phone while I'm eating? Or if I can't turn it off, could I put it on airplane mode? Can I try to just ground myself and see what's around? And that will also enhance the eating experience. So, okay, so that was honor your hunger, respect your fullness. And we will move on to the next principles next week and send in your questions. And thank you guys so much for being here. Have a great night.